1,000 years of history. Immigration was the fundamental building block in the creation of modern Australia. But what this new nation lacked was an identity. In 1901, the 6 self-governing colonies had united into one country, but without the usual struggles.
Australia had achieved nationhood without having to fight a war of independence, but that meant there were no grand battles and grand heroes to venerate. So there was this gap at the centre of the new nation's mythology.
But Australia was soon to fill that void.
War has shaped the national psyche profoundly.
And there was one conflict which would prove to be the defining moment in creating the country's identity. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. As an outpost of the British Empire, it was automatic that Australia would join the fight. As a result, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, better known as the Anzacs, were formed.
Australia enters World War I as a newly established nation, one that still felt it had to prove itself on the international or the global stage, and it gets its chance at Gallipoli.
The Anzacs were part of an Allied campaign in 1915 to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war.
Gallipoli was a complete disaster. They had to land on a beach with a cliff top above it, which meant that they were at an immediate disadvantage. They had to fall back, and they were in this kind of weird no man's land of not meeting their objectives, but gaining a foothold on the beach. And that foothold never really increased over the course of the battle, and in the end it had to be abandoned.
By October of 1915, after losing over 40,000 men in the hopeless campaign, the Allies saw the futility of continuing the battle and withdrew.
In the 8-month-long battle, Australia lost 8,000 soldiers. But because of the bloodshed, the Gallipoli campaign is seen as a pivotal moment that solidified the nation and gave the country its identity.
Gallipoli was the first order of business in being able to fill that gap.
There's this letting of blood and loss of your young manhood. So you explain it in national terms by saying we're doing this for the nation and the empire. They're sacrificing themselves on the altar of nationhood. So they become Australian as part of the identity. This is an act of national self-preservation. So it's a bit like the French Revolution or the American Revolution. It's a bit strange happening on a Turkish beach, but this is the first national act by Australians, and that becomes very important.
Despite the huge loss of life, the Anzacs became famed for being tough, resilient, and brave, much like the Bushman legend.
Anzac soldiers quickly establish a reputation that is in some ways emblematic of the type of society that has bred them and generated them. They show high degrees of initiative, and they have this thing about mateship. And soldiers talk about sacrificing themselves, not for some great cause, but for their mates. Because they don't want to let their mates down who are alongside them in the trench.
The Great War didn't end with Gallipoli. In March 1916, the Anzacs were sent to France to fight in the trenches on the Western Front.
The Western Front is the main game. Whoever wins the Western Front wins the First World War.
In the following 2 years, little gain was made by either side, but the Allied forces were not giving up, and the Anzacs were playing a pivotal role, not just in the war, but in forging the country's sense of itself.
You have Victorian troops and New South Wales troops, but they're fighting alongside each other. They're all Australians. They're all part of the Australian Imperial Force.
By 1918, the Australian forces have established themselves as one of the elite fighting corps of the entire Western Front.
The Allied forces, including the Anzacs, broke the stalemate, shattered German morale, and led the Empire to victory.
The Australian force is part of the force that finally breaks through the Hindenburg Line. So they're seen as instrumental in the winning of the war.
The world went wild with joy on November 11, 1918. This was the end of the worst war in history.
For Australia, the First World War remains the deadliest in its history. From a population of fewer than 5 million, over 200,000 were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner.
The First World War massively scarred Australian society. You had not only the gaping wound of all the dead and wounded who'd fought, but you had the grief of the family members who were left over.
Australia was hurting, but it had proven itself on the world stage, and the country was not about to let this go unnoticed. In 1919, just 2 months after a ceasefire was declared, global powers gathered in Versailles to determine the terms of the peace deal. In a move that was unthinkable just a few years earlier, Prime Minister Billy Hughes was able to get a seat at that table.
The Treaty of Versailles is one of the first instances where the Australians are on the international stage.
We weren't going to leave it to Britain or anyone else to talk for us, putting ourselves forward as a fully independent nation with its own contribution to make. For the first time, we were going to be sitting at this table, pushing our own agenda and our own priorities.
And they've earned this, they think, on the battlefield. We Australians fought shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield, so we should have a say in the peace. But there's also the division of the spoils. They talk about German reparations. What share of that are you going to get?
Due to Australia's significant contribution to the war, Hughes wanted a share of the reparations. He wanted the German colony, now known as Papua New Guinea, and he wasn't going to leave Versailles without it.
They want to hang on to it, partly because it's a resource, but mostly because it's a strategic location. These islands are the ramparts of Australia looking north.
And this is very much Australia wanting to ensure its security in Asia, wanting to have a buffer between these Asian nations and Australia, and so advocating for Australian control of the former German territories in the Pacific.
Hughes succeeded in his mission, took Papua New Guinea from Germany, and the League of Nations was established, with Australia as a founding member. This young country had finally succeeded in earning its place on the world stage.
It's a seminal moment in nation formation, really, recognised at Versailles.
But being a serious international player would come at a hefty price. In 1,000 years, Australia has transformed from a sparsely populated continent to become a nation in its own right. But this thirst for nationhood has come at the price of many. Just when Australia thought she had earned her place in the world, international events were about to shatter that security. When World War II began in 1939, Australia again declared itself at war and on the side of Britain, sending troops out to fight in the Middle East.
Heading into the Second World War, we were paid up members of the British Empire. All our eggs were in the British Empire basket. So our security was completely given over to Britain and their guarantee to us that their navy would protect us.
Just 2 years into the war, Japan launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, on the island of Hawaii in the Pacific. It shook America, but it also deeply rattled Australia as it brought the conflict much closer to home. This event would transform Australia's foreign policy forever.
Pearl Harbor. No need to emphasize the extent of the damage. It taught America that now is the time to fight for its existence.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor really raised anxieties in Australia about the threat from Japan. There were then concerns about Australia's security.
When Japan brought the war to the Pacific Ocean, Australians feared that the Asian invasion was fast becoming a reality. They called on Britain for backup, but their priority was fighting Nazi Germany. Australia was on her own.
More and more German towns are being wrecked in the Allied drive from the west.
All of a sudden, our security blanket had been torn away. We felt vulnerable and alone. It started a whole new debate. How do we guarantee our own security in the world? Britain can't always come to the rescue.
Australia desperately needed a new ally to help defend them. A country with muscle, power, and strategy. And so, Australia turned to America.
We feel that our fate and that of the United States of America are unbreakably linked.
The Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, makes a statement. He's saying we have a traditional relationship with the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom is not in a position to defend Australia at the moment. But the United States can.
Yanks are coming, and the tramp of their feet echoes round the world. Sydney really went to town. What a sight! What a welcome!
But it wasn't just a case of coming to the rescue. Both America and Australia would profit from this new alliance.
Australia provided a base for which America could launch its campaigns in Asia, and something like a million American soldiers passed through Australia during the Second World War. And so there were mutually beneficial arrangements in that relationship.
On the 19th of February, 1942, the day Australians had always feared finally dawned. For the first time in their history, the country was under attack. Darwin was a strategic port and airbase in northern Australia. The Japanese feared that the Allies would use it as a base to launch an airstrike on Asia.
The 27 Japanese bombers which raided Darwin were escorted by 15 fighters. They rained bombs on the north coast Australian town. The bombing of Darwin was the first assault by a foreign enemy on Australian soil, and killed over 240 servicemen. To this day, it remains the largest and most significant attack on the country.
The bombing of Darwin makes Australian citizens realise that this is not just someone else's war fought somewhere else and they're not fighting for someone else.
It's bringing the war to Australia in a way that it looks as though Australia's about to have its own blitz. London's been bombed to bits, other places in Britain have been bombed to bits. They're now bombing Australia. So there is this fear that the distant war that you had in the First World War is now a war that's in your own backyard.
The bombing of Darwin was a huge wake-up call.
After 3 more years of savage fighting, the war in the Pacific finally came to an end on the 15th of August, 1945, when Japan surrendered. The threat to Australia was finally over.
Home on leave after 4 years of battle, units of Australian fighting men get a thundering welcome as they parade through the streets of Sydney.
Let us remember the men, the women, and all the services who have laid down their lives. And then let us salute in proud gratitude for the great host of the living who have brought us to a victory.
Almost 1 million Australians enlisted during the Second World War, and over 100,000 were killed or wounded. As part of the Commonwealth, Australia had fought on behalf of the King and Great Britain. But in her hour of need, Britain was not there to reciprocate. The war forced Australia to find new ways to ensure her own protection.
From that point onward, America stepped in to play the part that Britain had played before as security guarantor and as very significant trading partner as well.
Since then, Australia has fought in many wars as America's ally.
Australia is involved in the Malayan emergency, it's involved in Vietnam, it's also involved in Iraq and Afghanistan.
In 1,000 years, Australia has seen brutal conflict on home soil and fought as an ally in the global war arena.
War has triggered these profound shifts in how we see ourselves and in how we secure our own interests and security in the world.
War is so important to Australians that it's often given religious connotations.
People sometimes talk about Saint Anzac. So the Anzac, the Australian soldier, is a saint in his own right. And the Australian hat, if you wear the hat at a particular angle, it looks like a halo.
Every year, on the 25th of April, Australia celebrates Anzac Day. The commemoration begins at dawn.
It is one of the most important days in the Australian calendar. It's got a type of civic religiosity about it. It's a sacred secular day for Australians.
It's a tradition which began in 1916 to memorialise the first landings in Gallipoli.
When a nation remembers its heroes of the past, when the diggers march again. 25 years ago on the shell-torn slopes of Gallipoli, they made their countrymen a nation.
But now, it's a day to remember all Australian heroes and the crucible of war, in which the country's identity had been brutally forged.
The idea of the Anzac story is birth and regeneration. You're dying on the battlefield, but you're also creating the nation in the new dawn.
Australians aren't that connected to their history, really. We pride ourselves as a new society by and large. And so to have these foundational moments in our history where we can just look at what has been done by those who came before and feel unadulterated gratitude and reverence is incredibly rare in Australian life. And Anzac Day is almost literally the one day of the year when we get to do just that.
War has deeply changed Australia. The country endured huge suffering and sacrifice, but also became more independent as it found its place and voice in the world. Australia, a country isolated from the rest of the world, and home to unique species that cannot be found anywhere else on Earth. For over 1,000 years, Indigenous Australians were custodians of this remarkable land, roaming free and enjoying self-rule. All that changed in 1788, when the British raised their flag in Sydney Harbour. Australia acquired not only a new regime, but a new leader, the British monarchy. The Crown has now been Australia's head of state for nearly 250 years.
You'd assume that we'd have no truck with a hereditary monarch, but we really go in for it.
The monarchy is incredibly popular.
From the moment Britain laid claim to Australia, it has been a loyal outpost for the empire. King George III was the first ruler of the colonies. But it was Queen Victoria's 63-year-long reign that made the biggest impression.
The monarchy is kind of inscribed onto the landscape in many ways.
There is, of course, Queensland, the state, Victoria, the state. There are many statues of Victoria across Australia, even though she never visited and probably barely knew where it was.
Despite Queen Victoria's huge popularity, there was a far greater voice driving Australia: the desire to become a unified nation. So, in 1901, Queen Victoria gave royal assent to Australia's federation.
The Federation of Australia was a key moment in Australian history.
Australia was given autonomy over their day-to-day business, but the United Kingdom still retained ultimate power over legislation. And crucially, federation transformed the role of the monarchy.
From that point on, the monarch has more of a figurehead role. She has a representative in Australia, the Governor-General.
The Governor-General is the largely ceremonial representative of the monarch and isn't meant to interfere with the practicalities of Australian political life.
Lavish celebrations marked the birth of the new nation. But the rejoicing was short-lived, as 3 weeks later, the news of Queen Victoria's death shattered the country.
Victoria's long reign finally ended just at the same time as Australia became independent. It had great symbolism, I think, for the Australian people. It really was the end of an era.
In the 50 years following Federation, several countries, including India, gained their independence and left the British Empire. In order to ensure former countries of the Empire would still maintain ties with Britain and the monarchy, a new organization rose up to take its place: the Commonwealth. When Queen Elizabeth II took the throne in 1952, she was determined to maintain a strong and enduring Commonwealth. And with Australia and America forming an ever closer bond, the Queen's relationship with Australia would prove vital.
The importance of the Commonwealth to Elizabeth II cannot be underestimated. Her father saw himself as the King of Empire. She saw herself as the Queen of Commonwealth.
Never before has a sovereign flown the Atlantic on a round-the-world tour to visit subjects in the Commonwealth.
In 1953, the Queen embarked on a 6-month global voyage, covering more than 40,000 miles, in a bid to win the hearts and minds of the Commonwealth and its people.
Really a case of the Queen going on this huge PR tour to keep the Commonwealth on side.
And Australia was the jewel in the crown of the Commonwealth.
Sydney Harbour Bridge, the largest of its kind in the world, is ahead. A fitting gateway to this great continent that is welcoming a reigning sovereign for the first time to its shores.
More than half of Sydney's population crowded round to catch a glimpse of the glamorous 27-year-old Queen.
Nearly 1 million people, many of whom had been waiting 24 hours in the streets, were there to wave and to cheer.
Australians had seen the Queen as a young girl in the images that came out of Britain during the Second World War. There was a degree of fascination with wanting to see this person that they had seen effectively grow up in the flesh.
I am proud indeed to address you not as a queen from far away, but as your queen.
Australians have a real kind of love for Queen Elizabeth II.
The moment that the Queen arrives to open her Australian Parliament, and a roar of cheering greets the royal couple.
The Queen came to the throne in Britain on this huge flush of optimism post-World War II. Everyone was saying World War II and the dark days, they are all in the past. Now we have the future, and the Queen is the future.
Details of what the Queen wore, who she met, and the events she attended made front-page news. And when she addressed the people, Australia came to a standstill.
This country offers wonderful opportunities for men and women. I pray that Australia will continue to prosper, and that from this national capital will come wise leadership and good government.
The nation embraced the Queen, and her 8-week stay solidified Australia's relationship to Britain. So any thought of Australia getting rid of the monarchy was put to bed for now.
It was really important going there as such a young queen. I think she loves the country itself, the outdoor lifestyle, everything about Australia. She loves the welcome she receives. And I think it's a very successful royal tour, certainly in the Queen's reign, and we see a great flowering of a relationship between Australia and Britain.
But in 1975, the biggest constitutional crisis Australia had ever seen threatened to shatter the Queen's special relationship with the country. The Prime Minister had been sacked.
There was this prolonged parliamentary deadlock where the opposition was refusing to let anything through. And the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was refusing to go to election to try and resolve it. And in the end, the Governor-General sacked the Prime Minister.
Governor-General John Kerr was the representative of the Queen in Australia. But he was not supposed to interfere with the day-to-day running of the country.
John Kerr meddled in politics and he changed the course of politics and he dismissed the Prime Minister.
Whitlam's dismissal not only created a national scandal, but it ignited discussions that it was time Australia ditch the crown, become a republic, and be governed by a president.
There is increasingly a feeling it is time for Australia to be governed by itself. I think the Whitlam scandal gave great fuel to the Republican movement in Australia because the argument, I think, that monarchists constantly wield against republicanism is by saying that, well, it wouldn't make any difference. Politics would always be the same. The Queen never meddles in politics. You have to have a figurehead, so why not have the Queen? But simply, this is just not what happened in 1975.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
As John Kerr was the Queen's representative, questions were raised over whether or not the Queen herself was involved in the decision.
Was he acting on her behalf or was he acting on her orders? Did she tell him that he should dismiss the Prime Minister because the Prime Minister was so unpopular and he was struggling? And did the fact that the Prime Minister was quite anti-monarchy in himself, did that play into it? I think this was completely breaking the covenant and breaking the rules. It is absolutely the case that the role of a constitutional monarchy is not to meddle in politics.
After more than a century of British rule, Australia's future as a Commonwealth country hung in the balance. But hope was to be found in the next generation of royals, as the Queen's passion for the Commonwealth was something that she had instilled in her children and grandchildren.
I have been here many times before, but I do genuinely feel that I am among old and valued friends.
When Charles and Diana came on a visit to Australia in 1983, it really was incredibly important. Diana was so popular in Australia, so loved in Australia. So for Australia to have Diana, William and Charles, it was huge.
But a series of royal scandals was set to put the future of the monarchy in Australia in jeopardy yet again.
The 15-year marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales has formally ended.
The fallout of Charles and Diana's marriage, Diana's discussion of the unhappiness she felt in the royal family, Diana's death in 1997 and the royal family's response to it, which was seen as very inadequate, you have a real crash in affection for the monarchy.
The Republican movement was gaining momentum, and to settle the debate once and for all, a royal referendum was held. The question of whether Australia should become a republic was put to the people.
The Australian people have had their say and they have said no.
The monarchists could not contain their joy.
55% of Australians voted to keep the constitutional monarchy. It was a close call for the Queen.
The question that was, should we have a monarchy or should we have a president elected by Parliament? And that, I think, was the sticking point. People in Australia thought well, I don't want someone who you lot elect. I want to have a president that I elect. I think that had the question been, would you like the Queen or would you like someone you elect? Well, that could have been a very different outcome.
For now, the Queen and the royal family could breathe a sigh of relief.
I think it would have been hard for her had the Australians decided to have a republic, not a monarchy. I think she would have taken it as a personal failure.
The Queen last visited Australia for her farewell tour in 2011, aged 85.
I can think of no more fitting way to end my visit here than in this idyllic Swan River setting. Once again, we will return to the United Kingdom with fond memories of our time here and the warm Australian welcome we have received on our 16th visit to this beautiful country.
The future of Australia's place in the Commonwealth now lies with the younger generation of the royal family.
I think why William and Kate and Harry, why they did so well in Australia was because they were much more relaxed. And certainly I think the tour of William and Kate is making one big statement. It's saying, if you stay with the monarchy, this will be your future king.
He does love it, honestly.
The young royals are undeniably popular. But with Harry and Meghan stepping away from their royal duties, do William and Kate have enough support to save the monarchy's future in Australia?
I do think the fact Harry and Meghan had to step down really has an impact on the whole Commonwealth, but also has an impact on feelings in Australia. They can't be used as secret weapons anymore to try and ensure sincerity and love for the monarchy.
I think Australians are divided on royalty. Whether we want our head of state to be a monarch in a foreign land, or whether we want an Australian child to be able to become a Governor-General, or indeed what they will be as a president.
Will Australia become a republic at some point in the future? I think, we can live in hope for that.
I think the younger royals, William and Kate, can probably save the monarchy in Australia because it's how royalty succeeds in modern democratic society. It's glamour, it's celebrity, it's a bit of showbiz, and it works.
Cast adrift from the rest of the world, Australia is a vast and extraordinary country of striking beauty and diversity.
The landscape is incredible. There's some of the most breathtaking scenery I've ever seen.
And it is home to some of the greatest natural wonders in the world.
Uluru is just this astonishing rock that sits in the centre of the continent. It's almost an unimaginable or surreal monolith.
And the Great Barrier Reef is the jewel in the crown.
Australia's Great Barrier Reef stretches for over 2,000 kilometres north to south. It's made up of thousands of individual reefs, and it is just exceptionally beautiful.
Bigger than Britain, Holland and Switzerland combined, it is the largest living ecosystem on Earth.
The diversity of life that you see and the diversity of forms that you see and colours is like nothing else on the planet.
This country isn't just famed for its breathtaking sights, but also for the treasure trove buried beneath its surface.
Some of the greatest mineral fields in the world are there.
Australia, in some ways, is a giant mine for natural resources. There's uranium, there's also iron ore.
Australia is also home to one of the largest diamond deposits on the planet.
The mineral wealth here is just endless.
For over 1,000 years, Australia's land has been a source of wealth for all those who have lived here. From the first Indigenous Australians who worked in harmony with nature.
Aboriginal people knew the land, they knew the weather patterns, they knew the environment.
To the later British settlers who forged industry on the open plains and in the gold fields of the south.
We are one of the world's great gold mining countries.
Gold may have been the foundation on which Australia's wealth was made, but it would be the discovery of coal which would have the biggest impact.
When the first colonists came here in the late 18th century, they were told to keep their eye open for coal, particularly because coal was in demand in Britain. And of course, Australia, we are now the world's largest coal exporter. It's the backbone, in a way, of the economy.
Coal and iron were piled up in mountains, easy to reach and easy to mine. Ready at hand was the milling equipment needed to process the ore.
Mining exports made Australia $280 billion in 2019. And China, once an unwelcome visitor, is currently Australia's most lucrative customer.
The Chinese tell me that they remove a mountain's worth of Australia every day in terms of iron ore and use it to build whole cities in China. You know, you look at Beijing, you're looking at bits of Australia, really. All of that iron ore, all the rebar and infrastructure, it's all from Australia. So it is a quarry. Australia is a quarry in a sense.
The resources which have made Australia incredibly wealthy are also destroying the country. The amount of carbon dioxide Australia produces is 10 times the global average, a consequence of excessive mining.
We see significant threats to Australia's natural wildlife and habitats posed by the mining industry.
Nowhere is this more evident than at the Great Barrier Reef. Acidic waters with rising temperatures are killing off the sea life sanctuary and putting its future in jeopardy. Conservationists are now predicting that the reef will no longer exist by 2030.
One of the great tragedies that's unfolded in my lifetime has been the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef. Today, you know, the cumulative impact is that probably 70 to 80% of the reef is dead. The rest is just hanging in there. But if we continue putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the reef will be tipped over into a new state which won't be as rich and beautiful as the state that I saw as a young man.
As mining continues to drive Australia's economy, the environmental consequences can be felt across the whole country. From devastating bushfires to lands now engulfed in monsoon rain, Australia is experiencing the effects of global warming more rapidly than nearly anywhere else in the world.
A few days ago, Grafton locals were talking about drought. Today, they're surrounded by this.
There has never been a flood of this height in recorded history of Grafton.
It's a very fragile ecosystem in Australia, and I think climate change is probably the biggest challenge Australians are facing today.
In this part of the Logan River, there's people who've yet to be discovered that they've lost their houses because their house is underwater.
This was a land that had been successfully managed for thousands of years by Indigenous Australians, but is now on the brink of disaster after just 250 years of European settlement.
In 2018 and 2019, we had the two driest years ever experienced over southeastern Australia.
The bushfire season now spans 9 months of the year. The fires, which broke out in June 2019, continued burning until March 2020. They decimated 72,000 square miles and killed an estimated 1 billion animals.
Anyone who was in Australia during a recent fire season would know what a wake-up call that was. We had smoke blanketing our major cities for months on end. I cannot emphasise enough how monumental these changes have been, and it looks as if these events will become more common.
And I've been living here since '74, and we've had other fires, but this is totally different. This is right out of the ballpark.
Australia is going to have to deal with climate change quickly.
If they're not going to change anything, then what's going to happen to humankind? What's going to happen to the whole world?
We need to ensure that this magnificent speck that floats in this universe is nurtured, cared for, looked after. What can be done for the future? Is it too late?
This country, once seen as inhospitable, was successfully colonised. But Australia is paying the price for it now, as its luck may have finally run out.
If we don't do enough and things continue as they are, the barrier reef will be lost. Our biodiversity will be gone. The things that make Australia special are really under threat. It's not the sort of country I want to leave to my children.
For over 1,000 years, the landscape is what made Australia unique in the world. In just over 2 centuries, this colossal continent was transformed into a successful and prosperous nation.
Australians, we pride ourselves as a new society.
But building a new country has come at a terrible price.
What do we want? An apology! When do we want it? Now!
We have to come to terms with the fact that our founding generations were both heroes and villains. You've got some incredible breakthrough moments of a new society, but they also committed catastrophic failures that damaged and broke lives.
As Australia comes to terms with its dark past and wrestles with its future, it stands today as one of the most multicultural nations in the world.
If there's anything that's unique about Australian culture, it's what you get when you bring those different peoples and their histories and their politics and their passions together. If you can see how different people have lived with the natural elements of the landscape for millennia, then you're starting to get a sense of what makes Australia interesting and beautiful.